and to Civil Alert. Thank you all to our loyal listeners and also to our first-time listeners. Civil Alert is an all-encompassing, holistic forum, and we address all different types of issues dealing with history, heritage, law, civics, politics, health, and spirituality. Tonight, our guest is Harriet Washington, and she is a medical writer and an editor, and she is the author of the book Medical Apartheid. She is on tonight to give an expose, and it's in correlation with the Senate ruling that came forth that actually denied funds for the sterilization victims in North Carolina. I saw this article because I wasn't aware of this happening because, of course, back in the days, we all heard about, the push for birth control and Margaret Sanger, W.E.B. Du Bois, and a host of others that worked to market the birth control marketing campaign to get many women to accept taking those pills. And now it's like I'm looking at this, and I said, wait a minute, I wasn't aware that back in 1929 that there was actually a law that was in effect that gave the go-ahead to eugenics. So although some of the people had passed, there was an estimated of 7,600 people that were sterilized, and it states here that some by consent or coercion without their knowledge, and it was a part of the North Carolina Eugenics Board program. So in light of all of the evidence coming forth, documentation, and even some of the victims, one of the victims was Elaine Riddick, who's now 58. She was sterilized at the age of 14 without her knowledge by the state of North Carolina. This evidence is there, victims are there, but for some reason, they were not funded. The victims did not get an award, and although there was a fund that was set up to compensate these individuals, the money was not released. One comment that I did read, it stated that the reason that the funds were not awarded was because that reward may serve as a catalyst for others to demand reparations for past infringements and atrocities. So we'll be digging in deeper into a big discovery here when we bring on Ms. Washington. But one thing that I do want to highlight is that from reading this article, I digged in deeper, and I was able to find an investigative report that several journalists with the Winston-Salem Journal, they actually had did a 6-month investigative study, and this was prior to, this case coming out, and it's published online, and it's a 4-part series. And in reading, I found out that there were a couple of heirs to the Procter & Gamble Company and Haynes Hosiery, and these heirs formed the Human Betterment League. And a part of their marketing strategy was to circulate a sterilization brochure, and it's a 12-pager. It's in a PDF, and I'll be more than happy to send this all out to you all. You could just send requests to news@civilalertradio.com. That's news@civilalertradio.com. And we'll dive in a little deeper once I speak with Ms. Washington. But, in summary, it's a report with caricatures on it. It's written like a little cartoon/child novel, and it's stating why the feeble-minded and the quote-unquote morons should not be able to reproduce. So this is something. And just to give you a bit more information about Ms. Washington, she works as a medical writer and editor, and she focuses on bioethics, history of medicine, African American health issues, and the intersection of medicine, ethics, and culture. Welcome, Ms. Washington.
Hello, Asha. Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, you are so welcome. I am honored to have you on. I'm glad that we were able to connect. I also have my co-host here, Elena Porter.
Hello. Greetings.
Yes. Yes, and Ms. Washington, as I was speaking to you earlier, I saw this for the first time today, and as me and Elena were speaking about this, she mentioned your book, and I see that this incident of eugenics and the sterilization, these tactics, experiments, it's nothing new, is that you have compiled a great work that provides an in-depth detail about exactly what has happened. I believe our guest has dropped, but she'll be back. She'll be calling back in. Elena?
Yes, I'm here, Santasha. I'm listening in.
Oh, okay. Yes, I guess we're having some technical difficulties. I was just speaking to my elder earlier today, and she did make mention that sometimes when the frequencies are just too high, that things just start happening. I guess we need to talk about the game.
Oh, yes, we need to talk about a game. Or some fried chicken.
Yeah, maybe that, but I believe we do have her back on. Let's see here.
Okay.
Yes,
Ms. Washington?
Yes, I'm back with you.
Okay, then I'm glad we were able to get you back on. Yes, and so one thing that I have to say that I am really, it's good to see that you took the time to bring this information forward. In many cases, people may decide they opt to go to medical school, become a doctor, get their own practice, and they may notice that there is some injustice or something that's not right with what's going on, and they pretty much go along with the program. So, on that note, at what point did you decide to move forward to do the research and to bring this forward to the public?
This is a topic, in general, the book Research Medical Apartheid deals with all aspects of research with African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Social history of research with us from the year 1619, when we first arrived on the North American continent, to the present, which was until I say early 2007 when the book was published. This topic had long been an interest of mine because over the years I had worked in hospitals in a variety of capacities, first lab technician, finally managing my own department, the poison control department, and I was continually coming in contact with case files that revealed to me how dramatically differently African Americans were treated, particularly in the research arena. Now, this was in the late 1970s and early 1980s, well before anybody who had medical clout had recognized racial health care disparities or considered it a problem. Back then, it's just the way things were done, and people weren't scrutinizing it. But it was painfully apparent to me. So from that time, I had been collecting information about the subject. I wasn't a writer then, so it had not actually been in my mind to write a book about it. I wasn't sure what I would do about it. I think I had more in mind that I would do academic research on it, which I actually have as well. I also am an academician. I've published in medical journals as well as in popular journals. But when I started medical school training in medical ethics, that I first felt well equipped to deal with the topic because a lot of ethical issues that are, the incidents themselves are quite dramatic very often, but the ethical questions can be a bit trickier. For people who are trained in the field, it's sometimes, how can I put this? It is sometimes easy to convince oneself that the abusive behavior is not racial in nature. And it's sometimes difficult to discern when it is and isn't. It sounds kind of strange when you talk about an obvious event like sterilization, but you have to keep in mind that during this time period, the historical time period in question, if you're talking about, say, South Carolina and Carolina, it began in like the around 1915 or so. And it was not only African Americans who were being affected, and no reliable numbers were being kept because a lot of the procedures were done secretly, were done deceptively. So the physician was performing a hysterectomy to render a woman sterile, but he wouldn't tell her that. He would tell her he was treating her uterine fibroids or that he was treating some other abdominal condition and would lie about it. So, of course, that made keeping the numbers very difficult, and sometimes it's difficult to use the numbers to show the racial disparity. So, all in all, you really need someone who is trained in medical ethics and has some training in demographics to be able to illustrate the racial nature of this. It sounds really strange. It's so obviously racial, but sometimes when people are not particularly looking for something, it's easy to overlook it. So this is how I became interested in originally, and my interest never flagged. The more I learned, the more I worked in hospitals, the training I received, the more urgent it seemed for me for someone to write this history, because nobody was doing it, obviously.
It's something that you mentioned that puts me in a mind frame of Dr. Jill Pilgrim, and at one point in time, she was working heavily with the internal surgery, and she was an OBGYN, and that was her move to get out of the medical industry because she noticed that disparity as well. So when this news came out about not funding the sterilization victims, given that the evidence was present and even from you from doing proprietary research, what was your initial reaction to that?
Well, I'm disappointed. First of all, I think it's really important, and it's really hard to exaggerate the importance of North Carolina having admitted culpability. Just the fact that it had admitted that it did these things. South Carolina as well. It's really, really important that the admission was made. And frankly, I have to be honest and say that sometimes when these things happen, it surprises me a bit. I know a great deal about the history of denial. So that was a positive step forward. However, having made the admission and having committed themselves to financial remuneration, which, let's face it, that's a very, how can I put it? It's a very inadequate way of, you can't compensate people for stealing their fertility. You can't compensate for using them medically. You can't compensate them for the psychological pain, for the effect on families, on marriage relationships of doing these kinds of things. It's just unutterable pain, and you can't compensate them. But offering a financial remuneration was at least a gesture, an indication that the state was willing to assume culpability and take some gesture of regret, of apology. And the fact that they failed to fund it, that they, after making this commitment, they did not go through with it, that's a slap in the face, among other things. It's disappointing for a lot of reasons. Yes, it's true that the people could very much use the money, but in an ethical sense, the money is only the top layer of this. There's also the symbolic importance of refusing to fund it. By refusing to fund it, let's face it, the state finds money for things according to a spectrum of priority. The things it finds most important, it finds money for. Not, quote, unquote, finding money for this means it was not high priority, and that's very disturbing.
Yeah, so in light of an admission being brought forward, since that they admitted to it, then the attorney would have the option to move forward and take this to a higher court. Yes,
the admission of culpability opens the door for legal action. That's true. And the problem is, although some legal action can be brought, I'm not a lawyer, but I have seen historically that these can be very capricious and very difficult to bring into reality. The problem is that you're relying sometimes on judges and sometimes you're relying on, the populace, and depending on the culture, not everyone's going to agree that the fertility of black women was valuable. So we understand that it is. Right-thinking people understand that it is. But if you're talking about a culture in which there's a great deal of ingrained racism, and a tradition of racism, you may well find there's not this critical mass of people in the state who will agree that this breach is harm and who will agree that it's deserving of financial remuneration. That's why it was so important for them to admit culpability and to be willing to volunteer some sort of potential penance, if you will. Relying on courts to do it is less predictable. It's a little more capricious. And, we're not only talking about things that happened in one state. North Carolina is one state. This is something that happened across the country, not just in the South, but in North Carolina. It happened in Boston, in New York, Los Angeles. In the chapter of my book entitled The Black Stork, the genetic control of African American reproduction, I detail how this was essentially a part of the eugenics movement, a global movement. So if you're talking about individual remedies for individual states, you're going to end up with this crazy quilt where some states will recognize they had a problem and agree to compensate people, other states will not, other states will deny doing it. Many states still deny that anything, untoward racially happened in their state. So it's not exactly justice. It's not something that's going to be, it's not the preferred way of going about this.
And on that note, can you please tell us a bit about the founding father of the American Medical Association?
Well, we're going back quite a ways. I think you're referring to James Marion Sims, right?
Yes.
Okay. And I think the AMA might contend with the founding father appellation, but he certainly was considered the father of American gynecology. He was a women's doctor. This was a few years before gynecology was actually a term that was in use. And women's doctors were they were all men, and they were almost completely white. Very, very few traditionally trained black women's doctors. And in the South, where Dr. Sims practiced, he was from, Alabama, and he lived in Montgomery, where he practiced. Most of his practice was on black women. This was actually the case for most prosperous physicians. They gained most of their income from treating black people, slaves particularly. If it were not for slaves, they would have starved and gone out of business. So slavery was central to his practice because not only did he treat black women, but he was intent on doing research. He wanted medical fame and glory, and he wanted to treat a particular complication of childbirth, a very bad complication of childbirth called vesicovaginal fistula. Horrible, horrible situation in which after long labor, the woman would find herself with openings left between in her genital area and the reproductive area and was rendered incontinent. Horrible situation. A lot of pain, a lot of infection, loss of fertility. And in the case of black women, planters and physicians complained at length that it made them incapable of working. They weren't able to work. So it was essential to find a cure for this. Dr. Sims coming to do it. He borrowed or rented black women slaves who he kept locked in a property, a shack in his backyard. And in this shack he would go and repeatedly do surgery on these women. And this was genital surgery, it was very painful, very difficult. And it was during the Victorian era, which made it doubly difficult because, women were supposed to be protected, fully clothed, modest. And here were these black women who were forced to strip nude and undergo these surgeries repeatedly. And Dr. Sims would do it in a laboratory into which he had invited local men to watch, as if it were considered entertainment. Finally, he was able to effect the cure of vesicovaginal fistula, finally. And as soon as he did so, immediately, he went to Paris and then north to New York City, where he became a very important physician at the American Medical Association, and also this did make his medical fame and fortune. But the women whom he operated on were held involuntarily. He refused to give them anesthesia because of a prevalent belief that black people did not feel pain. So despite the fact that he was repeatedly, slicing into their genitalia, sewing them up, repeatedly, they got no anesthesia for this procedure. His treatment of black women was very interesting in that when he got north and he was boasting about having cured vesicovaginal fistula, and writing numerous articles about it, he always illustrated these articles up north with images of white women, because he knew that unlike in the South, in the North, people would frown on his having, used enslaved captain women. So this way, by illustrating them with pictures of white women, he could skirt the issue of how he had abused these women, and he could pretend that these had been women of his own class who were undergoing this research willingly, which is actually what he said in his memoirs. He claimed the women had been willing, but of course they had not been. They had no choice in the matter.
You said the Victorian era, so about what time period was that?
Oh, let's see. I know it was during 1840, and it's important to realize that Dr. Sims was continuing a tradition that had begun before him. There had been many physicians who had conducted reproductive surgery in this country, and all the advances in reproductive surgery in this country were actually done by using black and mulatto women. And the reason is really chillingly simple. It's because white women were not interested in undergoing these painful, distressingly intimate reproductive surgeries, but black women couldn't say no.
Now, I would like to just share a little bit light about the terminology being used, and this is by no disrespect at all, but it's just to provide some insight and correlation to what we're talking about as far as history. And this is for everyone in the audience as well. Black and white are modern-day terms to be designated as, like, racial identities. However, when we look back in our dictionary, black is actually an adjective that means that one is destitute of light, or they have a low countenance, or one being in a state of mourning, where white was actually designated to mean that it was in a state of purity. When you do look in the 1828 dictionary, and that's the Webster Dictionary, the definition for an American, it is the copper-colored races of people that were found here upon European arrival. But for some reason, it has been placed upon us all to think that black and white are the actual terms that apply to the races, when in fact the term black actually came on the scene around the late 1400s through the Saxon language, which is affiliated to Germanic tongue. So I just wanted to just put that out for clarity for the audience. And the reason why I bring it up, Ms. Washington, is that it seems as if that what has occurred through chattel slavery and what occurred through the experimentation on these indigenous women. And when I say indigenous women, I mean indigenous women whether they were indigenous to America or indigenous to Africa, that this was just a further annihilation tactic to see to it that, one, they would not be able to reproduce. Because after all, if you had a situation where there were so many people and the majority, and if they were the minority, then of course there would be a lot of unrest and then a threat to, their weakness and annihilation. And they would have to pretty much keep on doing these tactics so that they can make sure that the population would decrease. So I just wanted to make mention of that.
Well, actually, there was an interesting change in the attitude toward African American fertility. During the period in question, the goal was not to curtail reproduction. They wanted African American women to reproduce. In fact, African American women tended to reproduce 3 to 4 years average earlier than white women, and were actively encouraged to do so, whether they were married or not. Planters wanted African women to reproduce because the more slaves were born, the greater their wealth would be. So African American reproduction was valued, and it was controlled by owners. They dictated with whom the women would sleep and have relations. As we all know, the owners and planters themselves often impregnated African American women, although there was a high rate of denial about that in the literature.
Right.
So they wanted
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So they wanted to reproduce. All this changed after the Civil War, When emancipation began sweeping the land, of course, it didn't all happen at once. Lincoln only emancipated certain slaves, and then gradually the rest were freed. Now, as this happened, this economic dynamic changed dramatically. No longer did the children of African Americans reproduce wealth to owners. Now they reproduced, as the dominant class often wrote, a burden on society. Because after all, who was going to support these children? The African American adults were not in a position to support them because of racism. They often could not obtain work. Literacy had been banned during enslavement, so certain types of work were closed to them. But the real reason they couldn't obtain work was pure racism. You know, people did not want to employ African Americans; they could employ whites for the same work. So as soon as the Civil War ended and the South was defeated, slavery was either dead or, on life support, the attitude changed, and now the fertility of African American women was a problem. It was something to be eradicated, something to be curtailed, something to be ended by any means possible. There were lots of medical journal articles that predicted the disappearance of African Americans from the continent, and they would even give signal years. African Americans will all be gone by 1900, by 1920. So there was a very radical change. But during the early period, they wanted African American women to breed, and they often encouraged them. I just want to make one point. I actually studied English literature as an undergraduate, and what's interesting is the word black was almost always used for people of African descent. Of course, like all words, as things evolved, it began to mean different things. It had a very strong pejorative effect right through the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s. I was around when people began substituting black example for Negro, and it was very interesting how among a lot of African American people, there was some resistance to using black. Older people thought that, as something of an insult. So listening to some of those changes in the language, I'm glad you brought that up, can be very interesting and very revealing, because these semantic changes, these language changes, tell you a lot about the change in mindset of people.
Right, you're right about that, about the changes, but the reason why I highlighted that is because bleak is like the root of the word black, and that's actually Old English around 450, circa all the way up to circa 1150. But prior to the introduction of labeling the people as black, they were always known as being Moors or Moros. So that was an international term that was used, and it was beyond, the Moors in Spain. That was just designated to a people that were melanated, also the people that were Muslims, and also to Moor is an ancient word that's found in the Syriac tongue in Aramaic, and it means to be a lord or a saint. So I just bring that up because in the dictionary as well, what people will find is that the word blackamoor is actually listed to denote a defeated Moor. So it's a reason why after a certain point in time, black was just used in the Moorish heritage was just pretty much obliterated and not really discussed or talked about. So that's the only reason, why I had brought that up.
I don't think we really want to spend a lot of time discussing this, but I do want to point out that Moor was not consistently used for blacks. Moor was actually a bit of a fluid term. It was a catch-all term. I said Moor was a catch-all term, so it was often used to encompass people who were considered quote-unquote black races, but often other words were used as well. So it wasn't that it was always used to know black people. That was culturally malleable as well. Etymology gets really, really interesting, and in terms of etymology, modern-day dictionaries are not terribly useful. The Oxford English Dictionary, though, does a really good job of in a short space, telling you a bit about the evolution of the language. But this is
Oxford is an eye-opener. And as an elder teacher of mine says, it's the reason why they don't teach etymology in school. It would open up a whole other can of worms.
But to study the language, and the reason is because it's just great job of etymology and showing words in context rather than, other dictionaries, which, by the way, are not science books and don't even attempt that. That's not their purpose. Their purpose is to give you a sort of quick and dirty understanding what the word means in a contemporary context.
Right. But yeah, we'll have to talk about that a little bit more offline, but I just wanted to have that as a disclaimer, for the listening audience there. And so, Ms. Washington, I remember, and there's a part in the book that Elena highlighted where there was a professor that came and asked you why you were writing the book, and she had made a comment stating, sorry, go ahead.
A medical school professor told me not to write the book.
Okay, she told you not to write it. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
And then her quote was that this book, your book, Medical Apartheid, may scare African Americans from, you may install fright or fear, and they'll be scared of to participate in any type of medical experiments. Was that her sentiment, or?
Right. This was a professor at a medical school, and as to the medical school where I was studying at the time, her concern was, her stated concern was that should I write a book detailing the experiences of African Americans medical research system in the U.S., that I would be healthcare. I would be in healthcare. And
please repeat that. The phone went out a little bit. It's like I think the phone is breaking in just a little bit. Mm-hmm.
She was afraid, she said, that if I wrote this book detailing the treatment of African Americans in the U.S. health system in terms of research, she was afraid that I was going to make black people afraid of medicine, afraid of doctors, afraid of healthcare, and do a serious disservice to black people. She was quite verbal and loud and vehement on the subject, quite dramatic, and it was quite a bizarre situation as I looked at her, because I thought to myself, I've taken your seminars. She had done seminars encompassing all of medical ethics and had not once mentioned any research that pertained to black people. You've shown no interest in the subject. When I've mentioned anything in the class, I get cut off. You have nothing in your syllabus, so why are you lecturing me, about the treatment of African Americans? I'm the experienced health writer who has 20 years at that point of experience of communicating with African Americans, so why do you presume to lecture me? But what I said to her was, you've raised an interesting point. Am I going to make African Americans afraid of medicine and health care, or has that already been achieved by the people whose work I propose to chronicle? And it has been. So that is, that's really a folk concern as far as I'm concerned. That's not a real concern. The real concern to me is very different. The real concern in the case in which we're speaking of selective sterilization of black women, the real case is a eugenic case. People talk about eugenics, and they tend to relegate it to a very short period of time, a very narrow space of time, and they tend to relegate it to Germany. They talk about when Germans, Jews, and other people who were not, quote-unquote, Aryans during the period of, say, the 1930s to the end of World War II. So that actually was only a very small slice of eugenics. Most eugenics was practiced right here in the U.S., and the U.S. was one of the pioneers of eugenics. Beginning in around 1915, it was the United States that had determined that they were going to promote greater social betterment of the country by weeding out people who they considered had inferior genetic complements, people who were had traits that would always make them polluters of society, would always make them contribute to the illness and to the social dysfunction of society. And Africans were the primary targets of eugenics, primary targets. So it was African Americans on whom this eugenic gaze fell, and whom physicians, social workers, even, unfortunately, some African American political leaders and writers fell under eugenics sway and decided that it would be very, very important to curtail the fertility of African Americans, that relatively few should breed and most should be, kept from breeding. And they weren't above using subterfuge to do that. They weren't above lying to African Americans to force them into situations where they thought they were receiving medical care, but actually they were being robbed of their fertility. Situations where, as I mentioned before, they called it a Mississippi appendectomy, but that's a misnomer because it was done all over the country. It was, as I pointed out, in New York and Boston and Los Angeles, as well as in the Deep South. Women who were told they needed some procedure or who simply came in to deliver their children, and without their knowledge or their permission, the surgeon would then remove their uterus or would do another procedure that would make them sterile, often without even telling the women. In the beginning of my chapter on this topic in medical apartheid, I begin with the story of Fannie Lou Hamer, a famous, symbol and political dynamo of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. That happened to her, and she always cited her Mississippi appendectomy as the outrage that made her into this political leader, this uncompromising political leader. She was robbed of her fertility in that way. When she thought she was having her fibroids removed, they actually removed her uterus. And that's when she learned, so she would never have children. And the surgeon hadn't even told her. She only found out about because of some gossip. So this sort of thing was done en masse. Tens of thousands of black women throughout the country were robbed of their fertility, and it's not something that happened in the distant past. This was done as a matter of routine training up until the 1970s, when medical residents in Boston and New York reported that as part of their training, the gynecology residents said they were told that if they treated a black or Hispanic woman who had more than 2 or 3 children, they were to sterilize her. And Columbia University, the medical students finally protested this. They had a protest because they thought that policy, and they were right, of course, was unethical and abusive. And the same thing happened in Los Angeles. Otherwise, if the medical students had not rebelled, we might not even have known that this was still going on there. So this has been a nationwide problem, and a problem that certainly did not disappear in the distant past.
Wow. So when this first started, was this like when World War II first started? Did that correlate, like, time-wise?
Frankly, because of the secrecy involved. As I said, the women tended to be lied to, and the records were intentionally either altered or not kept. It's difficult to pinpoint. I was not able to pinpoint when it began, but I will say I know that it began to be done above board very, very frequently, beginning in 1915. 1915 was a very interesting year in that there was, you remember Jack Kevorkian?
Yes.
Okay. Well, if you remember him, he was quite the character. In my opinion, he was a serial killer. But, he was a media hound. He liked to, these people with whom he had no doctor-patient relationship. He would hear them, he'd fly to them. They said they wanted to kill themselves, and he would happily kill them. And he would kill them with lots of press around. He would take there would be photo ops. He would give us little rants and screeds about how, you should kill people when their life is only worth living. And it was done in a very unethical way. He had no right to do this. He didn't have enough knowledge to know whether people were truly suicidal, whether they could have been helped or not. It was actually an abomination. But what was interesting to me, as someone who worked in newspapers at the time, was the press very often had this fawning admiration of him. I felt that there was not enough criticism of what he was doing. The same thing happened in 1915, but in this case, it was a doctor named Harry Hazelden. And what he did was he started killing children rather than older people. He began killing children who were born who had some sort of birth defect, some sort of traumatic disease at birth. Even though many of the infants were viable, they were going to live, he would make the decision that this child is not worthy of living. This child is not going to have a good enough quality of life. And more to the point, this child's going to be a constant drain on society who will always have to pay for this child's care. Better that I should euthanize him now. And he would get the parents' approval, and then he would do the same thing. He would call in the news media. He would make these screeds, explaining why it was better to kill children right away if they had serious problems. And shortly, other pediatricians began imitating him, began killing these children. in a lot of ways, and historians, of course, will have their own ways of judging this. I'm not a professional historian. But from what I have learned, in many ways, that Dr. Hazelden's activities in 1915 heralded the beginning of the eugenics movement in this country. Because although things had always been done, we didn't know how often they'd been done, and they'd often been done in the shadows, sub rosa, so that people didn't really know about them. They're kind of keep hidden. Now everything's up in the open. Now people are openly saying, okay, let's admit some people are not worthy of living. Some people are going to be a burden on the state. The state should simply kill them. So for the first time, this was open and above board and admired. And it was very interesting to me that Hazelden went on to become a movie star. He actually wrote like an earlier Rocky. You know, he wrote a movie about eugenics, about killing children who were not worthy of life, and went to Hollywood. They let him star in the movie. Actually, very, very successful. He made a lot of money. He was a wealthy movie star. There are very few, and there may only be one print of this movie extant. And I spoke to a man who does have a print of the movie. I actually saw the movie, and what's interesting to me is when he gives, at one point in the movie, Dr. Hazelden gives the panoply of all these children who are unworthy and who should have been killed at birth. The very first image you see in this movie is that of a black child.
Oh, my. And what's the name of the movie again?
The Black Stork.
The Black Stork.
In the movie, you have a wealthy white person who's got a black servant. Whether she's a slave or not is sort of, skipped over. We don't know. Well, he gets drunk, and he has sex with a black servant. And the movie's about how the resulting child of that union provides a genetic taint that ruins the entire family. So we can see that right from the beginning of the U.S. eugenics movement, African Americans were associated with being eugenically undesirable and seemed to be pool because they supplied a taint in the U.S. gene pool that was going to eventually cripple the country, was going to cripple it. So this message was very clear and resounding, and it persisted, as I said. Quite frankly, it's still haunting some medical practices today, quite recent practices. I'm not willing to say that I think that there is a eugenics practice in the country today. It's not as dramatic, it's not as above board, and it's not called genetics. But the same attitude, the same assumption that the children of African Americans are worth less and are inherently problematic, are defective and inferior, that notion still exists. Not as dramatically as it did in 1915, but it still exists today, and it still infects the way medicine is practiced and the way research is done.
So I'm connecting the dots here. So we have a situation where there was massive enslavement. Then we have periods of lynching, and then we have a situation where there was medical professionals actually sterilizing women, and then we have a situation where one of the professionals actually ends up in Hollywood, and a movie is made about it to further spread the propaganda.
Exactly. The other interesting thing that happened that I don't think has gotten nearly enough attention is that, again, Germans are the poster boys here. People are always, and they should, always criticizing, disparaging the Germans for their abusive eugenics policies. They're right about that. But what people don't say is that the Germans and the U.S. scientists worked very closely together. The United States scientists worked very closely with German scientists, and they even had a group, a eugenics group, between Germany and America. It was called the International Society for Racial Hygiene. And one of the leaders of the eugenics movement here in the United States, Charles Davenport, and his assistant, worked really closely with his parallel doctors in Germany at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. When I went to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, it was really interesting. They had Eugene Fischer there, who was focused on African and non-whites, on the extermination of African and non-whites, because Germans wanted to exterminate non-whites as well. And there was a lot of communication between people at the Eugenics Records Office here in the United States, at the Wilhelm Institute, and there's a lot of communication between the medical group societies. And the Germans actually said they learned a great deal about prohibiting racial mixture by studying Americans, especially Americans in the South, where the Southern doctors had come up with these very precise formulas for determining not only who was black and white, but who was white enough to marry a white, who's white enough to vote. It varied from state to state, but there were all these formulae, and the Germans happily accepted it. And the Germans often bragged that they were much more lenient than American scientists were, because the Germans would say, well, in this country, we'll accept somebody who's 1/4 Jewish as a German, who's 3/4 German. But in your country, in the United States, if a person has only one black ancestor, you call him white. You don't accept him as white at all. So the Germans actually would brag that they were more lenient and that the Americans were far more repressive in their eugenic behavior. When it comes to African Americans, I think they were right.
Oh, my. This is something else. So the Germans were working in conjunction with the American medical professionals and making sure that this happened. You also, earlier in the conversation, you mentioned that there were also some African American leaders as well as social workers that played a role in collaborating.
Yes.
Who were some of those people?
I think it's really important to keep that in context, though, because although they were indeed in some aspects of eugenics lip service, they certainly weren't doing it as repressively as were others. And some of them, I think, were frankly used. For example, W.B. Du Bois, everybody knows, was a brilliant man, not the kind of person you think of as having been led. Yet he made some statements that I think I disagreed with, and certainly sound horrible taken out of the context. And Margaret Sanger consistently took them out of the context. And, I mean, they were not good in context, don't get me wrong, but Sanger made them sound even worse than they were and constantly repeated them. And it's very useful for her to say. Even a leader like Du Bois has said, I think one of the things that Du Bois said and that Sanger constantly quoted was, the mass of ignorant Negroes still breed carelessly, disastrously. So that the increase among Negroes, even more than the increase among whites, is from that portion of the population least intelligent and fit, and least able to rear their children properly. So here you have a prominent black leader arguing for eugenic measures. Now, the eugenic measures W.B. Du Bois had in mind, I'm sure it differed dramatically from the ones that Sanger had in mind. Sanger was a she was also a feminist, she was also a birth control advocate, but she was primarily a eugenicist, and she erected some of her first clinics in places like Harlem and at Fisk, because she felt very strongly that blacks needed to have their fertility curtailed. Black people could not reproduce and should be actually, forced. She actually thought that black people contributed to crime, and a lot of the tenets of eugenics she adopted came to black people, so that she would actually do things like she had a special issue of one of her journals devoted to African Americans and eugenics, and she invited people like Du Bois and Charles Johnson, the president of Fisk University, to contribute to them, and they did. They would contribute, and they would say, black people need eugenics. We have too many black people, especially lower class and poor black people, who are breeding too many children.
So Fisk
that
University.
was a godsend for Sanger.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So that was a godsend for Sanger, of course.
And Fisk University, that's one of the historical, the HBCU is a historical black college, correct?
Right.
And that was Charles Johnson?
Yes. However, I think it would be a mistake. I mean, I'm not excusing what they did in my chapter. I criticize it. I think, obviously, they were in error. That was a mistake. It was a disappointing mistake for black leaders to make. But it pales compared to what was done to African Americans by white people in power. Du Bois and Charles Johnson were not advocating sterilizing people against their will. That was not at all what they were. They were advocating. They were advocating that African Americans voluntarily and consciously limit their fertility. And frankly, what they were saying, you have to remember, it was consonant with the zeitgeist of the times. That was all through the United States. They weren't saying anything that was unusual. I mean, many intellectuals, many academicians in the United States then were saying the same thing about many groups, not only African Americans, but of course when they said it, speaking to African Americans, it was immediately seized upon and used by eugenicists like Sanger and like the frankly abusive eugenicists who wanted to force black people into sterility. They used their statements against black people to further their own efforts. So we have to keep this in context. It wasn't a good thing for them to say or write, but it certainly was not. They were not responsible for what happened to black people.
Wow. This is something else, because I'm thinking having such high-profile positions back in those times, it would be equivalent to, let's just say, we could parallel that to police officers that can know that people have not committed any crimes but yet stand by and see and really collaborate with the infringement of people's human rights and their constitutional rights. And then, we have a lot of tasing now. People are getting shot. And then all of a sudden, 20 or 30 years down the line, 30 or 40% of the population has pretty much been annihilated based on some of the very same people who look like them that maybe gave a pass, so to speak, to the situations that were occurring. So I see what you're saying, that, they took two to tango, more than two to tango, but it's just a sad situation where you would have people to co-sign and collaborate and to look at people that look just like them and, be in compliance. So that's a sticky situation right there.
Yeah, it's very difficult to say this. However, I would stress that your analogy with the police is not exactly one I would subscribe to, because the police actually are doing more than violate civil rights. The police that you're speaking of, the abusive ones, they're actually harming people. They're physically harming people. And again, as I said, Charles Johnson and Willoughby Du Bois did not have it in their mind to violate civil rights, to force them into sterility, to force them into doing anything, and certainly not to harm them, to do surgery on them against their will. They had it in their mind to convince African Americans, that eugenic precepts were good and that they should have fewer children, which is not good. You're absolutely right, which is not good, but it's not at all the same thing as actually practicing violence on people.
Well, if I may chime in, I beg to differ with the description of Mr. Du Bois. I'm not his fan. He's made several comments that were contradictory during his earlier years, but somehow, towards the latter ends of his life, he tried to go back and make amends with some things that he said and some things that he's actually done. So I just beg to differ on the I can understand why you would have that point of view or that perspective, but I'm not his fan, and I can see how the damage that he did do just by the spoken word,
Well, as I said, I agree that he was wrong in saying this. I'm simply pointing out that he didn't physically injure people.
Oh.
And on that note, in your research, did you come across any information about the Human Betterment League?
Yes. I didn't actually go into a great detail about that because it was one chapter, not the tome that a book on eugenics would have included. Human Betterment League was one of many similar leagues that sprang up. Actually, there are a few of them are still extant today. There are the Population Council, which actually invented Norplant. As I discussed in the latter part of the chapter, we talk about eugenics as if it were something in the past. But most of us remember Norplant. It's being distributed up until 1992 in this country legally. So that Norplant, which was 5 or 6 progesterone rods, are implanted in a woman's arm in order to give her 3 to 5 years of infertility. Contraceptive that a doctor had to implant and a doctor had to remove. 90% of the women who received Norplant were on Medicaid. Most of them were black women and Hispanic women. It was very, very heavily promoted not only to adult black women, but to young black girls in very racially racially homogenous sites, like the Baltimore school system. There were these schools where the school-based clinic, where the girls were like 95% black, and they actually pressed Norplant upon these girls, did everything except physically force it on them. They were essentially forced into using it. So that Norplant was actually, as I said, made by the Population Council, which had its roots through this era. It went through several permutations, but it was actually begun by Margaret Sanger, and it still actually carries out her ideals. There have been a few members of the Population Council who have denied that they have a eugenic agenda, but if you look at what they've actually done, it certainly looks as if they do. So there are lots of groups like this that, as I said, are still extant. They're still with us, and are still have been very, very active in promoting these kind of eugenic measures. By the way, Norplant was not only forced on young girls and on black women proportionally. Norplant was also used to threaten adult women by judges who would tell women who were convicted of a crime, I'm either going to sentence you to jail, or you can have Norplant implanted. So these women would accept Norplant in order to avoid jail. And this is certainly very coercive. It's certainly an unethical way to administer a medication. You don't force people legally to take a medication under those circumstances. And when the data came out, 85% of the women who had Norplant forced on them were African American. So something that was used in a very racially stratified way, and we're talking about the 1990s. We're not talking about the distant past. So that's another eugenic measure.
Right. And then for you to be able to uncover this, and, I had mentioned that report from the Winston-Salem Journal as well, where they have pretty much got a hold to thousands of documents and reports and minutes pertaining to this eugenics board. So this is not something that was just like hidden or covert.
Except that eugenics board, if you think about it, and I think what they've done is great. It's the kind of thing that I did in several instances in order to write the book. When I looked at many, many questions, I had to, of course, I went back to the original sources, far further back than what they were looking, but also some more currently, because there are so many questions that had to be answered, and there are lots of documents. But we also have a problem with some of the documents. You have to remember that when you look at the minutes of groups with agendas, and when you consider the practice of the time, when a lot of the medical practices were done either in secret or were done by, frankly, lying to people, deceiving people about the true intent or about the true nature of the practices, then you have to, and also, when you look at the desultory record keeping, sometimes racial record keeping was done very well, sometimes it was done very sloppily, and sometimes that was intentional, because sometimes groups were cagey enough not to want to reveal the racial nature of the activity they're engaged in. So they were either, as Dr. Sims did, when he illustrated his report with just white women, the same kind of thing has been done by groups who wanted to hide the racial nature of things that they were doing. They did not want it to be recognized that a large majority of the people, for example, whom they were abusing were African American. So they would eat fudge, or they would fail to keep or, quote-unquote, lose the racial records. So anyway, my whole point is that when you look at the records of groups like this that have a clear agenda, then you understand that these records can also be faulty.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, they can be doctored. What's happened to me is, as I looked at a lot of these original records, I've been looking at these records as early as the 1800s to the present day, and I consistently see the same kind of errors creep in that tend to paint a very different picture of what's transpired than what's transpired. So I've learned to be very wary of, quote-unquote, lost records, or records where the racial nature of a lot of the patients is not known. But this would be a state like North Carolina, where there's a very dramatic racial animus that's always existed. And if you look at an era during which racial records were kept very carefully, and then you might wonder, well, why are there no racially complete records for this particular research? There might be a reason for that. So, I mean, it's very good that they did that work, but I think it's really important to keep in mind the nature of the organization whose records you're looking at. They say in computer, garbage in, garbage out. So you have to be careful about that.
Right, exactly. And in light of all of this, Senator Don East, he just states that he's sorry that it happens, and he just doesn't think that money shall fix it. And then we have here Charmaine Fuller Cooper, the executive director of the North Carolina Justice for Sterilization Victims Foundation, went on to tell the News and Observer that the foundation was shut down by the end of the month because of the funding has ended. And we have a victim such as Elaine Briddick, who, along with her attorney, will more than likely move forward for at a higher level, at a higher court, for a class action lawsuit, and other countless victims that probably feel totally disrespected and dishonored, given the fact that all of the evidence have been brought forth, historical, documented facts. So I have to say, Ms. Washington, in thinking about this, I'm like, is there really any justice here in our land?
Not yet. We haven't seen justice yet. What we have seen, and we should not discount its importance, we have seen an admission of guilt. That's important. Mm-hmm. We don't always do that. And without that, it's more difficult to go forward. The admission of guilt is good. But frankly, to say that the money won't fix it is quite disingenuous. We know money won't fix it. It's impossible for money to fix it. And as we discussed earlier, you can't compensate someone for the loss of her fertility. You can't compensate, a couple for the descent in their marriage when they can't have children. You can't compensate a family for being robbed of an entire generation. And something that the Commission has not discussed enough, which I think is very important. We talk about individual victims, which I think was a good thing. It was really, really good that we saw individual faces tied to this abuse, so that people understand we're not talking about a theoretical or hypothetical or historical problem. We're talking about people's lives. But we're talking about something else. There's something else that has been damaged here, maybe beyond all repair. And that is something that people are not talking about that I find really important. I'm talking about the faith of African Americans in the medical system. People who have gone through this kind of experience, whose family members have gone through it, people who have even heard about this kind of experience, are very loath to trust the American medical system. And as someone who spends a lot of time inside the system, I constantly hear physicians and researchers say, how can we make them trust us? Why don't they trust us? What can we do? And I'm always tempted to say, well, we can start behaving correctly. The problem is not with African Americans' fears. The problem is with an untrustworthy medical system. And the system has to change. Every time something like this happens, and every time a promise is made about it and people back down, more people lose trust in the system. And for African Americans, we can't afford that. We can't afford to distrust the system. We can't afford to avoid it. We already have the highest death and disability rates for almost every disease. And the last thing that we can afford is to be afraid to go to the doctor, to be afraid to seek out health care, because we don't know what's going to happen to us. I think of those women in the 50s who are having children who did the right thing by going to the doctor, getting prenatal care, going to a doctor, having them deliver their child, to be abused. You can't compensate a people for losing their faith in the medical system that they desperately need. And that's something else I think that has to be addressed. And it has to be understood better that when people wring their hands about African Americans being afraid of the system, they really should be wringing their hands about the system being so rife with these kind of behaviors that people cannot trust it.
Right. And I think, too, that this may serve as a catalyst for more of the sisters and brothers to really start taking heed to dietary habits, sleeping patterns, exercise. Because it's and then another thing I have to say is that this may also show people that maybe they need to go back to some of the ancient ways of the ancestors where there were a lot of herbs and just natural remedies that were used. And I hear what you're saying, that, the diabetes is out there, AIDS is out there, but we do have healers out there like Dr. Sebi, who went to the Superior Court and won his case that documented that he had a remedy to cure AIDS. And one thing, like with Dr. Sebi, which he has documented, just like, pretty much the researchers, like yourself, you have documented historically about what has happened in the establishment. He does have documentation where just by alkalizing your diet and having things that are more alkaline as opposed to having more acidic things in the body actually aids in healing. So hopefully this will just be an eye-opener, because I have to tell you, Ms. Washington, that around some of the elders that I know, even though in the ancient times, their diets were more pure and they didn't drink like a lot of sugary drinks and things of that nature, but it seems like it was a change and a shift from them being in good health, and then where they pretty much left the South, because, during that great flight from people leaving from the South going up to the North, there was a change in atmosphere, change in diets and things of that nature. And then, they started going to traditional doctors, and a lot have ended up on a lot of medication, and they don't actually have real remedy. So, and then when it comes to hearing about their traditional practices that they knew that they grew up with, it's this aversion, and it's pretty much like a social conditioning now to say, no, 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 the doctors have the answers. But one thing that I have to say is that with looking, because see, and most of the people, they're not even aware of like your research or what has really happened in this case with North Carolina. But I'm like, just looking at this and able to see these documented facts, I would be scared to death, I have to tell you. Scared out of my mind.
That's my point exactly. People are afraid.
Yeah.
But I have to say, I don't agree with you that, and this is a matter where people have different opinions, right? But I don't agree with you that the answer is embracing our own health by supporting it with nutrition and exercise. Those are all good things, and we should do them, absolutely. But we can't rely on them. It's not enough. That's certainly what more of us should do, absolutely. But that is not going to protect us from the diseases that kill us. And I also have to say, I have the greatest respect. I've done a lot of study on traditional African medicines and remedies, and they were wonderful. They were wonderful. They pioneered a lot of things being used today. However, they were not good enough either. They were the best that they had that day. But let me assure you, if we found an African healer from, say, 1750 or 1800, who brought them to this country today, they would rapidly embrace the bounty of the American healthcare system. They were brilliant using materials they had at hand. But that's what they had then. They didn't have access to the medications we have today. I mean, centuries have elapsed. There have been centuries of development. And we need today's medicines. Exercising, eating right will not protect you from the killer diseases. It will protect you from a lot. It will certainly bolster your ability to survive a lot of conditions, but a lot of the things that affect us today in modern diseases is not going to save you from modern diseases. You can be the best athlete in the world. You can have a perfect diet, and if you contract hepatitis C, you may sicken and die without treatment very rapidly. The variables very often, once you become ill, what we have to understand is that natural medicine is good, but it's not appropriate for everything. Once certain diseases develop, the body systems have already been broached and weakened to the point natural support is not enough. There's a time to support yourself using natural medicines, always in conjunction with your traditional doctor, always. It's important they not be working at cross purposes. But there's a time when you bring out the big guns, when you develop a cancer. If you develop melanoma, diet will do nothing for you.
Ma'am?
Yes.
Okay, you said that if you develop melanoma, diet will do nothing for you? Ma'am, I'm glad that we brought this up, and I will implore you to reach out to Dr. Jewel Pilgrim. the healer Adama, as well as Dr. Sabi, as well as the Raw Food Institute. They're actually based here in Atlanta, where a lot of these people, they have track records. And also, too, Dr. Simoncini out of Italy, who has been curing people of cancer by using baking soda, and he's an international oncologist. So I hear what you're saying, but you cannot refute the fact that the blood cells are actually made as a result of the food that one eats. So your food and what you put in your mouth, it does have an effect. And don't get me wrong, there are some environmental things that occur, and we can't even, we can't ignore the fact about the water supply, the municipal water supply, and what's placed into the water, like the ammonia hydroxide that's used to, quote-unquote, kill the bacteria, according to what a watershed manager had informed me of in Atlanta. So there are a lot of other environmental things that can play an effect, but I'm thinking for precaution, we can't just really say that the diet and then the exercise and things of that nature does not play a role, not to even mention with dealing with us, a lot of the chemicals.
If I may, I think we're getting a bit off topic here, and I stand by my
statement. We are, but it's been a good...
If I may, I will say, however, that I'm sure these physicians you mentioned do excellent work, but there's really no need for me to consult them. When I did my book on hepatitis C, I dealt with traditional as well as conventional remedies, and as I know that there's a place for both of them. My point was not about the virtue of traditional versus complementary and conventional medicines. My point was that we need the medical system. We need access to the healthcare system. If you need a liver transplant, you need a liver transplant, not a better diet. And it's a great disservice to encourage African-American people to shun the healthcare system. We simply can't afford that. Our health profile is dire as it is, and we're already not being availed of many of the advances of medicine that keep other people alive and healthy and functional. So we need the healthcare system. It's fine. I always advise people to, if you have a nutritionist or a natural healer you want to embrace, that's great. Use them and your conventional doctor. Let them know what the other one is doing. Have them work together. You, frankly, can use both. But it's a mistake to avoid conventional medicine because that avoidance is partially behind our higher death and disability rate. That was my only point.
No, I hear what you're saying. But what's the classic I'm saying? It says we'll agree to disagree. But I hear what you're saying on that note when it comes to, like, dire things like, liver transplants and things of that nature. Elena, I understand you have a question, and we have a caller that's coming in as well that has a question, and so we'll get to him as well. But I'm sorry. Go ahead, Elena.
Okay, I have a question. Why has no criminal charges ever been filed with all of this documentation about the misleading of information they gave to the patient or the people that they did the research on? Why has there been no criminal charges? I mean, they would get my trust back quickly if I saw somebody go to jail for what has happened. It's just.
That's an excellent point.
I mean, that would be one way to win my trust back if someone was actually punished for this, not just monetary.
But
not just monetary.
That's a very good question, and there's several reasons why. On one level, it's the same reason why there are no documented rapes of black women by white men throughout the South before the Civil War. We all know that they happened. It happened frequently. But there are no charges because the system has colluded to prevent them being charges. The system colluded to say that it didn't even happen. But on another level, the reason why that doesn't exist is because of the law. Same thing in this case. Under the law, during enslavement, a enslaved woman could not be raped. She was a property of the master to do it as he wished. So whatever happened to her sexually, unless the master's will was violated, no rape occurred. Now, if you look at the eugenic laws,
Around 1927, there was that famous federal case of Buck versus Bell, where a white woman named Carrie Beck, the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. She was called mentally inferior. I think idiot was a term used, and promiscuous. For that reason, she was to be sterilized. And the court agreed. They said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Very famously. As a result, there were not only federal law, there were all these state laws that were actually mandating, not just legitimating, but mandating eugenic sterilization measures. So a lot of this activity had been legal. Now, the cases where the doctors lied to the women and did it without their will, surely that wasn't legal. But unfortunately, in order to have a plaintiff, you have to have someone who knows they were injured. The woman who was on the table, who uterus was taken without her knowing while she was unconscious, often didn't know until far too late what had happened to her. And she's a black woman undertaking a case against a white doctor. Well, Fannie Lou Hamer spoke about that. And someone asked her the same question. They said, well, you've discovered this doctor removed your uterus when you thought you were having your fibroids taken off. Why don't you sue him? She said, suing a white doctor? She said, I'd be taking tacks and screwing them into my coffin. So, it's an excellent question, and it's horrible to understand that one of the reasons why there were not legal charges brought around this historical abuse is the powerlessness of black women in the legal system. I think it's a chilling reminder to us that as rough as things are today, and they can be very difficult today, as we all know, there were times in which they were all but impossible. And why charges aren't being brought now for some of the more recent abuses? Well, again, there were laws legitimating a lot of this behavior. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. We don't have time for that. But I will say in the case of Northland, part of the problem was even though it was unconscionable to place black women, mostly black women, in a position where they had to agree to either incarceration or implantation of Norplant, it was legal in most cases. So there's not a legal precedent violated here. Very frightening precedent.
There are so many legal contradictions within the U.S. They project this ideology of freedom, ideology of fairness, but when you get down to the real meat, it's all like a big lie, so to speak. It's like, where's the justice in doing some of the things that's been described in this book and the incident in North Carolina? How do you come to trust an establishment that has a history of this type of behavior, and they don't even think enough of the victims to give just a simple gesture of restitution for what they've done? It's really hard.
That's it exactly. That's why it's so disappointing. After having admitted this, which I was looking at as a positive step forward, then to renege on your promise to fulfill the terms of it, as I said to Asha earlier, it's a slap in the face. You're basically saying that you've done this with impunity, and you don't feel that you should have to even make a token gesture of apology. But when you ask what to be done, if you're not already familiar with it, there's an excellent book by Dorothy Roberts entitled Killing the Black Body, which goes into a lot of detail about the reproductive injustice done to black women. And I'm actually heartened by the fact that we've got lawyers like Dorothy Roberts, people who lay bare this, make it harder and harder to hide it. I think that to trust the system, this might be a little crazy truth. I don't know if you saw the movie Jack Brown. There's a line in that movie that really resonated with me. It was so funny. Someone asked Samuel Jackson, how can you trust this particular woman who's, already shown herself to be less than reliable? He said, I don't have to trust her. I know her. And I think that that's something that we need to take part in dealing with some of these systems. I'm heartened by lawyers like Dorothy Roberts and other lawyers because they know the system, and they're willing to
confront it about its shortcomings, and to basically be watchdogs and call it out when it tries to do something like this in the future. And for individual people like you and me, I think the key is knowing about these abuses should make us much warier consumers. I was arguing a little while ago that people, black people, simply cannot afford to shun the American medical system. But the corollary to that, the addendum, the other important thing to remember is that when you use them, use it with your eyes open.
Oh,
your
yes.
knowledge
Yes,
of this,
that's true.
your knowledge of this history should make you a very wary consumer. You should get up a pain in the butt. You should ask a lot of questions. You should definitely, politely, of course, you don't want to offend the person you depend on for your health care, but you should not be shy about asking questions. You should not be shy about voicing some of your concerns. Because one thing I have seen about physicians is a lot of them tend to respond to individual patients. They may indeed treat some of their black patients a certain way, but when they see that you are someone who's going to expect and won't settle for anything but a high standard of care, that's going to affect how they relate to you. Patients who ask a lot of questions, who are very involved, get a different level of treatment from patients who don't. And that doesn't matter whether you're getting care in a Medicaid clinic or you're getting care in a private clinic. You can affect the behavior of some physicians. In fact, I would venture to say most of them will react to someone who will tell the physician, I'm serious about my health care. Here's what I'm really afraid of. Here's what I want. Can you do this for me? You can't. This is not a situation in which you're going to be passive. You don't want to be passive and a lump on the log, because very often doctors will not volunteer, things that you need to know. So that's what I do, and that's my only advice at this point. I do have a primer that's going to go up on a website. I expect, within, I would say definitely by late August.
And can you please share your website? I'm sorry.
Yeah. I don't want to do that because, frankly, it's not up yet. I had it up for a while now. I'm migrating to someone else, and as a result, I'm doing lots of revisions, which won't be done until August. But if people are patient and are willing to wait until mid-August, it's just the title of the book, medicalapartheid.com.
Okay.
On that site, I tell people exactly what questions they should ask when seeing a doctor and when contemplating engaging in a research study, and exactly what to watch out for.
Ms. Washington, I must say thank you so much for having the courage to share this information and doing the work on this on your book. I've learned so much during this interview and reading your book, and thank you for having the courage not to let the person who tried to discourage you from working on your book, because it's offered a wealth of insights and information to just a layman like me, and I've learned so much just by this one interview.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes,
and that
I
means
agree.
a great deal to me.
Yes.
And thank you for having me here. I really appreciate the chance to talk about my work.
Yes,
Thank
we
you.
definitely do appreciate you. Do you have a moment to take a question?
Of course.
Okay, thank you. Welcome to Silver Alert Radio, caller 760-705. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
That's great. Do you have a question or a comment?
I have a question. I'm going to make it very short. I'm going to come off the line so I can listen. I just love what you guys are doing tonight. The question is, African post-secondary students are afraid of taking studies in the healthcare field and are being denied opportunities in graduate studies. The most important information a student requires is held in graduate studies level. What is your remedy to this? And what are the other opportunities available to obtain and study information for our latest healthcare technology and obtain research case studies? So my name is Phoenix from Canaanland. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you for your question. Because the sound quality wasn't great, and I'm not sure I got all of that. So just correct me if I don't have it wrong. But I think you were asking me about the best route for obtaining education and training in healthcare. Was it healthcare technology you're interested in? For young people? Okay.
You can hear me clearly? Yeah, pretty much a lot of the information that we require is in is in the graduate studies level. And as we as university students are trying to just go through biology 100, 200, 300, 400, we're getting discouraged just by the nature the professors are giving us, just by the attitude we're getting by other students. Just altogether, we don't feel that we belong. And a lot of us are just going into other fields when we really require this information for our families so that they can open small practices or just apply these things for our future generations. So if a lot of us can't handle the stress that comes with that, is there another way of us to receive the information?
There are other ways to receive the information, but the best way to receive the information is by standing your ground and pursuing the program that you're interested in. It's an unfortunate fact. We're people who are serious about our scholarship, as I'm sure you are, and the people you're talking about, you get used to being encouraged in academic settings, and I know from personal experience it's very, very disturbing when instead of being encouraged, we're suddenly discouraged from pursuing them. Yes. I don't know if the stories have changed over the decades. You recall being told things like, medicine's an unrealistic goal for you. I remember being told that there were no African-American doctors, and I had never seen one. I lived in a city where there weren't any, so I believed them. And because it was coming from academics, I gave it more weight than I should have. But I say, don't listen to these discouraging statements. The academics who are supposed to be helping you train and learn, they should be there to support you. Their job is not to dissuade you. And if they're dissuading you, don't listen to anything they say. And don't be swayed. Don't leave. Don't pursue something else. Go for what you want to do. Part of the reason is practical. If you get training within that system, you're going to be able to do a lot more good than if you go outside of the system. As you know, going outside of the system, you can learn exactly the same thing, get the same quality of instruction, but you need to remain inside the system to have the maximal impact. That's just a sad fact. But don't be discouraged, and remember that as bad as you and your colleagues are experiencing now, in my studies, one of the things I learned is it used to be so much worse. I think about the many people who wanted to study medicine but couldn't because, well, first of all, they couldn't at one point because they weren't allowed to learn to read. At another point, they weren't admitted into the schools. At the point, they were admitted into the schools, but they were marginalized and kept from higher education. They were allowed to become MDs, but only allowed among other black people, and not allowed to get residency training or specialty training, which means they could never do research. So as bad as things are now, remember that our forebears, our ancestors, went through much, much worse, and they still persevered. The only way you are going to persevere and get the training you want and do the thing that you feel you've been put here to do, your mission is to ignore this bad advice and continue in the face of it. Don't be stiff-legged. It's not easy, but it's worthwhile. So just as when that medical school professor told me, and, part of the problem, too, you have to understand is it's internal, because there's the aspect of someone externally telling you that you can't do something, you shouldn't do something. And that person has credentials that should make them credible. But there's also your own internal fears. All of us, or almost all of us, have that fear, am I really able to do this? Am I really the right person to do this? Am I really a fitting person? I once gave a lecture, basically, that was entitled, You Can Be a Scientist. I talked about the very simple but very powerful ways in which women and African Americans are often given a message, you cannot be a scientist. So that when the first person tells you can't be a scientist, you listen and listen. Society has told you that your whole life. I've been really long-winded about this because it's something that has happened to me personally, so I know exactly where it's coming from. But the best advice I can give you is stay the course.
Thank you so much. Peace and blessings.
Peace and blessings, and thank you for calling. Enjoy the rest of your night. Yes, well, Ms. Washington, I want to thank you for coming on. Is there anything, I know what, one thing that I forgot to ask that I just wanted to make mention of. In your research, other than the Tuskegee experiments, was there anything that you uncovered involving men with the sterilization tactics?
A great deal. Well, no, you said with sterilization because you didn't involve sterilization. But you mean anything involving men in general or men and reproduction?
Men and reproduction. I stand corrected. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, I just want to make sure what you're asking. I found a great deal pertaining to men. Pertaining to reproduction, yes, I did find some things. There was a Dr. Frank Liston who made the pronouncement that black men were all infected with venereal diseases, not in connection with Tuskegee. And he said that for that reason, they were very dangerous. They were dangerous to white women because they did not resist raping white women. They would invariably give her some horrible sexually transmitted disease. This came from a doctor. This statement and other statements like it became a basis. It provided a medical underpinning for lynching because very often the social historians will talk about the very real fact that people lynched black men and they would use as the excuse, we didn't want to put this white woman through the ordeal of a trial. So that's quite absurd, but that's what they would say. But what they wouldn't say is that physicians had repeatedly told them that to be raped by a black man was a medically devastating event that could ultimately lead to the death of the woman. So horrible statements like that help to impugn the sexuality of black men and women, maybe even more so. And there are also cases, Depo-Provera was used to sterilize black men to rob them of their fertility because of the fear that they would assault women. So throughout the history of medicine in this country, black men have been identified as sexual predators. It's a horrible slander on black men. And if you look around, it's so obvious that we haven't totally shaken off as a society. You know, you're always reading these horrible, insulting suggestions that black men are more likely than other men to be rapists, that kind of thing. And what people don't realize is a lot of those suggestions have, in history, a medical basis because doctors would actually validate this viewpoint. And so research was done on black male sexuality. I have an early anecdote about how casually the fertility of black men used to be robbed. They used to castrate black men, remove their testicles on any pretext. There was a early anecdote in my book about a young boy, I think he was like 11 years old, who had been playing with friends, fell and injured his groin. The doctor patched him up with no problem. It was an uncomplicated injury. But then on a whim, the doctor decided to remove his testicle to study it. Not because the young boy needed the removal, because the doctor simply wanted to remove it and study it. And that anecdote, that was about one boy, but that shows me the horrible casualness with which that kind of thing was done to black men. So there were lots of cases of black men being abused and cases of black men's fertility being used as well. There's also the more subtle but very real abuse of black men by using them as studs for reproduction. The masters of the slaves would decide with whom the women would have sex, and often he would buy or select men not only for their physical labor but also for their ability to stud. I think a very good book by Charlotte in more detail. I'm trying to remember its title. It's a shame. It's an excellent book. I'm sorry I'm blanking the title. But if you look at Charlotte, you can find it. Anyway, so black men were certainly, demonized medically as well.
Wow. So more propaganda that affects, and I should say more social engineering that affects the minds of people. It is something else how just putting out information like that and repeating it over and over, and then on top of that, interlacing it with the media, movies, advertisements, can pretty much just leave an imprint in one's brain.
Well, as Lenin said, a lie told often enough becomes the truth.
Yes, it is something else, and it's something scary. So I'm glad that I have to agree with Elena. I'm glad that you had the courage to do what you do and to bring forth this information, because I feel that, like you said, if you're going to be involved, if you're going to be a consumer, then it's best to at least have your eyes wide open and to know what you're dealing with. Yes.
Asha, I have to tell you, thank you so much. I have so enjoyed speaking with you and for the chance to talk to all your listeners. And to you and Lena, thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you so much. And enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Take care now. Bye.
Thank you.
Helena, you know, one thing that was key, and this definitely, we have to have a part two to this with dealing with some attorneys, or I should say some adept law students, scholars, I should say.
Yes.
Because the issue of status did come about, and that being that the women were at a slave status, that they really wouldn't have any say-so against what happened. Another thing, too, that was key. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, Santasha, if we take a real good look at and track the abuse as she did from the 1800s until what happened to Miss Riddick I think it was in the 1970s is when she underwent that forced sterilization. Yes, we do have to readdress status, take a look at status. And also we need to find out whether or not there are any criminal laws that, you know, could be applied to that situation in North Carolina.
Yes, you're right about that.
Or are there any even on the books? Because what I'm looking at is, I mean, what happened to those people were criminal at best. I mean, they should have, forget, you know, restitution. They should be sitting in jail for what they've done.
Right. I see what you're saying. And one recourse that they may say, is that there was an actual law on the books that gave the okay, the eugenics law, saying that it was okay to move forward to do those things. And even though that law in itself is totally unconstitutional and it violates international treaties in regards to human rights, that may be something that they could stand on, but I guess it would be up to her attorneys to move forward to push this matter, because this is a big deal. This is a very big deal, especially with given the amount of evidence that's brought forth by multiple sources. Yes. Another thing, too, that was key that Ms. Washington mentioned was how a doctor will treat a patient differently if they show that they are aware and have concern, which is also addressed in status. But status is just not anything legally dealing with paperwork. It's also the condition and the state of the mind. So it's something to address as well. We have about 10 minutes left, and I did want to close out with a couple of pieces from Dr. Jewel Pookrum. But in closing, did you have anything else that you'd like to bring to the table?
Well, like I said, this show was a great show. I really enjoyed our guest, and she brought forth some real good information. And I just don't know, after reading this book, that I can go to the doctor right now. I'm going to have to give it a month or two to trust the medical establishment again. Not with all this evidence, but
yeah, I hear you.
It's really an eye opener.
Yeah, especially when she highlighted and talked about the beginning of the American Medical Association, because you have to think about it before then as well, before it was brought forth. You know, they condemned a lot of the ancestors here, if they practice natural healing and actually use remedies, they were classified as being witches. And so it's historically known that there were numerous amount of witch hunts before this American medical establishment even came about. So it's something about the roots. And then here it is, 2012, we're looking at these fruits where I have to go again, documented evidence there, and still there was no restitution. So, and also, I just wanted to share with everyone to get a copy of the propaganda brochure that the Human Betterment League brought forth. And again, I have to highlight this because Marketing done. It was through, yes, the people, some of the medical professionals, as well as some of the social workers. But in addition to that, they actually had brochures that were circulated and sent out to people to pretty much pacify them and to gain acceptance. Because I guess it's just subliminal, like persuasion. If you put information in somebody's face enough, and then if you make it look pretty, you put the little images there, then it's like, oh, this may not be too much of a bad thing. But I have to emphasize that this is a 12-page document, and it was brought forth by the Human Betterment League and some of the heirs of the Procter & Gamble and Hanes Hosiery are some of the people that were involved with bringing this propaganda sterilization literature forward. And to get a copy of this document that was actually published on February, I have a date stamp of February 6, 1950, please send a request to news@civilalertradio.com. Again, that's news@civilalertradio.com. And the reason why we have this show is because Civil Alert exists to bring forth information that is informative, engaging, and third eye opening. So, granted, in our day-to-day duties, we do have to get on our grind and everything and get the fiat to make sure that we can pretty much have our food, shelter, and clothing. But as it says in Proverbs, in all you're getting, you have to get an understanding, or I should say get an overstanding, so that we know our history, the heritage, and that will influence our actions and our future decisions. I want to thank you so much for tuning in to Civil Alert Radio. This is Asha, and we have here